But I'm sure the allocation will be related to your topic. You know, they're not going to take somebody who's doing sort of high-level qualitative human users, human computer stuff, and then send you to the engineer who thinks in formulas. I'm sure that they will. I really do believe that they're making a very sincere effort this year with the themes to allocate you to a supervisor under a topic they like. And I want to tell you that there's something called a cohort. Now, a cohort is a group that passes through. So there's a cohort who is a year ahead of you. You are a cohort. And you will be, am I right that there are going to be like 6 major themes that you can be working within? Am I correct in that? Yes, okay. Well then, what could really be very nice is that, so let's say that this particular theme is called KLM, and there are 2 supervisors who want to work in that. Then those of you who are with that supervisor, let's say 10 of you are with that particular group where there are 2 different supervisors, you are like a cohort within a cohort. And it's actually very nice to actually have meetings and talk to each other because you're working in the same theme. In academia, we really believe in collaboration. You can maybe share literature sources and that type of thing. And because there will be overlaps in your work, and then you will go there and you will go there and you will make something in that environment, that sort of thing. So I think there are advantages in these themes. I did say with my PhD, my supervisor at UP, because I did my own discipline is computing, information systems. But I also had a master's degree in computer-based learning, and so, which wasn't even called e-learning in those days. And then I did it, for my PhD, I did it through TUX, like you, through education, and I did it in computer integrated education. So it was absolutely fabulous, because it's combined my computing with my e-learning, which was within education and within computing. So it was super. And my supervisor did have a lot of people. He had probably had more students than any other supervisor. So he tried to have meetings and make us sort of help each other. But I wanted to move really, really fast. So I actually withdrew from the group. But for those who stayed on, they like all wrote this section at that time, and then they wrote that, and they read each other's work. And it was very kind of congenial and sociable and collaborative, and you may find it works for you. But let me just get this right. Most of you are not on the staff of the university, is that right? Who works for this university? Okay, a handful. So the rest of you, do you work in corporate or business? Yeah, corporate, right. You see, and you probably also actually work in computing, probably work in ICT. So obviously for you, it's not that easy to get together, because it's not as if you're like full-time students on the campus Monday to Friday. Or is there anybody who's a full-time student? Nobody has that blessing. Very few.
I can come in here because collaborate. Have you heard about collaborate? Part of my tutor?
Yes.
Yes, it's like Skype, but it's just designed for teaching and learning. You've got access to it. Please use it. You can make groups. Everybody's got access to it. You can make groups and you can form groups. One can sit in Johannesburg and the other one can sit in wherever. Sorry about interrupting, but
no, it's a very
good advice.
Yeah, but you see, I was giving advice in principle. Now you're turning it into a way of practice.
This is really good advice. I also sense the vibes amongst you. Yeah, but it's really a lonely route that you're going to, path that you're going to walk. Get groups together, and if you are in the same one of these 6 disciplines or areas, form groups, because in those areas the supervisors are 10 to 1 going to be the same ones, or 1 or 2 are the same, and then you work the road together. Really, I think this is excellent advice that you're giving, Prof. Yeah.
You see, what happens is, though, that up to a certain point, especially at the beginning when you're struggling with formulating research questions and what is really my argument, which literature sources are good, then the group can help you tremendously. You can support each other. But basically, once you go onto your own way, then you will probably kind of do this. But the group can be a super foundation. As I say, with my PhD, I wanted to move really fast. And so I felt that I'd gained a lot of value from the group, but I just needed to move on. And the moving on happened at the right time. The group was a super foundation. It just helped you chill because you're all so scared. You know, what have I let myself in for? And, you know, will I manage and how will I start? Can I do it?
Can I do it? Yes, you can. But you don't answer. We can build, if you talk to Dr. Etienne, we can build in, it's a half an hour session, how to use Collaborate in grouping, making groups together. I can help you with that as well.
Right, okay, so what are we doing now? We've basically covered everything, and this is going to be some revision. Because we've been talking about the process. I'm saying you do it like this, you do it like that, you should do this. This is one alternative. End of the day, it's not about the process. It's about the product. It's about what I always used to call your big book. And now, UNISA has gone to electronic documents and electronic submission. What is it here? Do you know? Is it still a big book? You'll find out. I must ask Dr. Etienne. Okay, but anyway, the process will end. There's got to be a product, which is your dissertation. And so now I want to tell you just how to polish your process, how to actually optimize it and get a really nice product. And I think you can guess that what I'm going to say in this, very little of it is new. It's a wrap-up, so it's going to go really fast. It's 12 minutes to. Let's see how long I can do it. Okay, so, and as I have said many times, what I'm talking to you about now is academic writing. It's whether you are writing a proposal like you are now or a dissertation and an article. And these are fundamental principles. You've got to articulate the need. You can't just say that what you want to study. You've got to show some foundation, some evidence as to why you are doing it. Substantiate that need by what the literature says, as well as your personal motivation. And as I said to you, the literature, you may be really lucky, somebody in the literature may have said, as further research, this should be done, and you say, yay, that's me, that's what I'm going to do, I'll answer your need. In other cases, it's not like that, and you identify your need by showing that there isn't really anything close to what you want to do, and other people have done things in different ways or different domains, so there really is a need for what I want to do. And then there's also a personal motivation. No reason why you can't mention that. The student of mine who worked on e-assessment, she actually wrote a thesis on that because she had to deal with very huge first-year classes, and she had tried to tackle selecting multiple choice systems, and she just had so many problems. There was like no guidance in selection, no evaluation method. So she did her PhD on an evaluation framework. I told you that evaluation is my thing, and I've had students who've done evaluation frameworks for this and for that and for that. And she did an evaluation framework for multiple choice question systems based on all different categories, each with criteria, so that it would help somebody selecting one. And so she wrote a personal motivation that she had the literature, yes, but the personal motivation was, I personally wanted to do it because I had these large classes and MCQ questions seemed to be the answer, but I ran into problems in choosing a set. Have I? No, there we go. So this is where you don't just do it. You have to tell the reader up front what you're doing. I've said that now about 10 times. Guidance and signposting. Point forward as to what is come, the linking. Perhaps this I haven't done as much. Point backwards, and the backwards is when you link it to, with the golden thread to your argument, just reminding us all the time, just in a gentle way, of where you are really heading. I am not saying you write your research question in any chapter, every chapter or your argument, but just that the way in which you write it, the direction in which you're heading is clear, and that often happens by a few backwards cross-references. And you tie it all up with a golden thread. Now there's that moment that Prof. Tace described, when all of this was in his head, and eventually his supervisor said, look, you've got to write something. Now I have such sympathy for that, because starting something is the worst. And I can tell you, even after years and years in academia, I still get writer's block at times, and I find myself, when I have to start something new, that I all of a sudden go and buy groceries, or I tidy a cupboard, I'd say to myself, what's wrong with you? And I'll tell you what's wrong. It's that block, almost a fear of it's jolly difficult to start. And it is for me. It is for you. It was for Prof. Tace. Okay, so how do you start saying something? Well, I like to make it simple. Do you know what happens? Sometimes the person in the office next door to you says, no, we're not seeing much of you these days. You're cutting your coffee breaks short. I know you're doing studies here. So what are you doing? What are you heading? And you know what? And I have heard this so many times. You just talk off the top of your head. You're not talking out of the literature. You're not talking to that very special, scary person who is your supervisor. You just kind of talk. And I've heard absolute words of wisdom coming out with that. And you see, it's not in academic language, it's just in everyday language. And very often that makes a really good lead sentence. I can remember once a student who came from Cape Town to visit me in my home office, and we were talking about her work, and I was talking about a section that I had found very complex to read. And she got quite agitated, and then I said, okay, well, tell me, all right, I know you know what you're doing, tell me about it. And she just talked ordinary English. And it was so fantastic. I said, whew, stop, let's write this down quickly. Let's write it down quickly. So it wasn't loaded in academic language. Now, of course, your thesis, your dissertation is an academic document. But those words in everyday English to just set out your intentions, or your reasons, or your motivation, that come in everyday English are absolutely super as lead sentences to a paragraph. So, if you feel you don't know how to start, you are now surrounded by, you have now loaded 59 and a half journal articles onto your thesis, you have a pile of research methodology textbooks, and you just don't know what to do. So, how do you start? Simply by the way you would tell somebody. So if somebody asks you what you're doing, you'll be astonished about how much has been synthesized in your subconscious by your mind, and you're actually a lot wiser than you think you are. So just, how would you tell that person? Well, write every section starting with a simple sentence. Then you fill up the academic stuff. That is when you set out the shelves of your cupboards, which are your subheadings. And then you write those subheadings into your chapter, your draft, useless, inadequate chapter. You write those things in, and then you start throwing things in. You don't know how satisfying it is. You're not working from there. You've got these subheadings, and of course they will evolve and change. Of course some will be dropped, and of course more will come in. There's no magic formula. I don't want to be accused of saying, this is how you do it. It will evolve. It will develop. But put those first headings in and then throw it in. This is the shelf for my socks, and that's for my t-shirts, and every article you read, you start packing some stuff into those shelves, and then you look at them and they are a big mess, but you sort it, you organize it, you tidy it. And I've said this before, just repeating myself, remove the duplicates, identify the gaps, and go on another hunt to get more stuff. Or the same thing exactly applies if you are doing a research instrument or guidelines for developing an artifact. Exactly the same thing. You will have these themes, and you will pack stuff into the directions you give yourself, and then you will read it, and you will tidy it and make it much nicer. Yeah, now checking and correcting. I have touched on that, but now I want to touch on it holistically. Just remember, everything I say applies to your macro study, the thesis as a whole, and also to the individual chapters. So, ideally, your checking in a perfect world would start early and continuously. But you see, when we work on details bottom up, that is pumping stuff in, we do lose the overall picture and we miss things. But after a break, you should be able to spot the slips and the gaps. So after a break of a day or so, or taking a weekend off, then you do holistic top-down checking. You see, we build it bottom-up by filling in paragraphs and sentences and writing things. But top-down is when you look at everything you've done and you judge it and you assess it. And you really can do it much better after a bit of a break. And that break will also give you time for things like shopping and the baby and fishing and all that. And when you go top-down, you must look for errors. Have you actually written something which contradicts itself? Not on purpose, but by accident. You've actually written something and it's almost undoing what it's trying to do. So that's a mistake. Look for inaccuracies where you haven't said enough. Look for omissions. And I've said many times, resequence it. You can resequence by turning a sentence around. You can also resequence by reorganizing sections to consolidate them. Just find out what isn't clear. And then ask, well, why isn't it clear? Is it because I didn't write it correctly? Is it because my writing can lead to misunderstandings? Very, very often it's that. That's why I told you in another presentation to write it right. But it could be that you just need to add in a bit more evidence. But really, so often, it's not what you say, it's how you say it. There are, of course, implications. Chopping and changing must be done in context. And I'm now saying something I said in the previous presentation, and to me it feels like repetition because I know the talk well. But for you, it's probably a good thing to hear it again. You've got to chop and change in context. You have added something new. Now please read the whole section carefully. Is the thread intact, or is this new thing I stuck in like a bad part on a piece of fruit because it just doesn't fit and you almost want to throw it out? You see, moving a chunk of text, line 4, to a different place can actually result in paragraphs and sentences that make similar points, and you have stuck it here, but meantime 2 pages further back is actually something else where it would have fitted far better. So you say, okay, I'd better move it, or otherwise, no, but I really do need it here because it does belong here. But the problem is it just doesn't flow. So all I need to do is like add a linking sentence at the beginning of it. So when this sort of thing happens and you find that you've dealt with something in 2 places, but one is better than the other, integrate and rephrase to avoid duplication. Examiners hate repetition, they really do. So try to consolidate, so get the right things together, but also get something that flows. And the first sentence or the last sentence of each paragraph can play a very good role in that. And then finally, the heading was chopping and changing in context. You can see I like C's. Just ask yourself, does the new stuff fit the context? Does it fit the heading? Maybe it's not the stuff that's wrong, it's the heading that's wrong. Just let me go back and soften that heading and make the heading fit together. That can also be a really good way of getting something a bit jerky to come better. Okay, but that was about adding stuff. Remember, going away leaves a gap. And I told you about my experience with chapter 1 and supervisor saying move those 2 pages. When you decide something really fits better, and this is my experience, too much detail in chapter 1, that would be better in the lit review, then go ahead, move it. But leave something short behind because, you see, it was there because it needed to be there. But it just didn't need to be a sermon. It just needed to be a short overview. And after you've, I'm getting too excited. I think that it's very robust, isn't it?
It seems like. I didn't know it. It's also an experiment.
Okay. After you've moved the text, reread both sections, the place where you took it out and the place where it went in, and check that the threads are intact. It's very important that tables and figures and text must talk to each other. Your figure mustn't just be something there. There's got to be a build up to it, and there's got to be discussion. So you do need to write a paragraph about every table or figure, highlighting the key data. Force your readers not to ignore it, but equally important, for goodness sake, don't rewrite the whole table in words. I have seen somebody who did that. Here is this table, and it was quite an advanced person doing a PhD, and I was very surprised to see it. After the table, they then wrote a whole page which told us everything that was in the table. Cut it out. Remember what I said? Emphasize key points. You can use color coding to emphasize things and refer to them. Refer to the table. Force your reader not to ignore it. Don't say everything. Mention major points. In particular, mention distinctions, things that are different from each other, and that's going to get your reader into it anyway. Color coding can be fabulous. Color coding can also be very good in figures. You can even use the color coding in your writing, especially when everything's electronic. You don't have to pay in a lot of money to print color pages. So you can actually use green for that row in the table, and you can write about it in green if you like. You don't have to. It might be a crazy idea, but I just share all the little thingies I've learned over the years. And whatever you do, remember, be nice to your supervisor. Well, if your supervisor doesn't like it, it's fine. You know, you really, if it's a choice between something I tell you and what the supervisor believes in, go for the supervisor any day. Similarly with figures, don't just show a figure, you've got to talk a bit about it. Your headers and titles, I've already told you that, they must have a consistent style. Either they start with just a capital letter or you capitalize every major word, but just be consistent in terms of uppercase and lowercase. Uppercase being capitals, lowercase being small letters. Also, very important, and if you automate your TOC, it normally comes right, but I have seen errors there. I've seen an automated table of contents that somehow duplicated, and this was in a final dissertation, a final thesis actually. There was like a half page of subheaders which appeared at the top of the next. So please check against the table of contents that everything is there. Check two ways, that everything's here is there, and then check from that way to that way. You can see that the finalizing takes a lot of time. Just make sure that everything is there. If you add a figure, make sure that all the numbers move up, because now you've added a 5.5. So the previous 5.5 becomes 5.6, etc., etc. Make sure, bottom bullet, you refer to every table or figure. You can't just put it in, even if it fits in. Just one sentence. Table 6.2 shows the researcher's reflection on the three major findings. Don't just do it. So there's quite a lot of Nikes here. Don't just do it. Make sure you support it. This is much more specific, emphasizing the previous point about table numbers and figure numbers. It's almost inevitable that when you get near the end, you might add some more tables or figures. You might merge two tables. You might decide that these are two very silly little tables, and by adding a few more columns and rows, I can put them together. That means the table 4.4 died and it got merged into 4.3. Now you've got to go for the rest of the chapter, and chapter 4 is your data. Wow, goes right up to table 4.27. Well, you've got to go through a whole lot of them, making them one number less, and check that it is either automatically or manually included in your table of contents. So, okay, now somebody added in table 2.8, and they had table 2.8 followed by another table 2.8. Somebody removed figure 3.17. It really was actually, didn't add any value. So it went from 3.16 to 3.18. So that's where I say all the upcoming table numbers must change. Really important, it irritates examiners. Cross-references. I recently examined a PhD. Now there's a lot of discussion about should chapter 2 be your literature and chapter 3 your research design, or the other way around. And you know, it's one of these it depends things. It depends on your study. Well, this particular person had obviously swapped them around at some point. But the cross-references in the rest of the dissertation back to chapter 2 or chapter 3 were all wrong. So I read something which said that these methods are listed in section 3. From section 3.2.1 to section 3.2.5, I went there and it was all about the literature. Went to chapter 2 and 2.3.1 to 2.3.5 matched. So you see what happened. Swapped 2 chapters, fixed that in the table of contents, but didn't check the references, the cross-references. Any cross-reference to either of those 2 chapters was wrong, because she hadn't changed them. Do you understand what I'm saying? Yeah, so that is, I was actually horrified. It showed that neither the student nor the supervisor had checked the text one last time. Yeah, I avoid little bits and pieces at the bottom. When you're working, don't worry about your pages. But when you get to the end, just make sure that there's no header at the bottom with the content on the next one. Now this is quite important, and it's based on real life things. It's about using the same style of grammar. So here is, I told you evaluation is my big thing. Here is somebody doing a usability evaluation of a certain system. So what do? We list the categories and we list the criteria in that category. So the first criteria is easy to use. I mean, the category is the system easy to use? So it's easy to use. And then the criteria are quite good. The system gives immediate feedback. That is a full sentence with a verb and a subject and an object. But the next one says aware of progress through procedure. Who is aware? What is aware? It's not, the grammatical structure is different. The next one, chorus, that's got a verb in it. Look at that, that's easy to use, it's like an adjective, and then corresponds with the real world. And the criteria were realistic graphics and dealing with familiar objects. Then we come to user control, and then we've got a really nice criterion up top. It is clear how to navigate through the environment. And then we have can type or use drag and drop. Do you see that the grammatical structures are different all over the place? Now let's have a look at how that could be fixed. And by the way, that's not going to fail you a dissertation. If it's a really good piece of work, it's not even going to stop a distinction, but the examiner will complain and say the grammatical styles in table whatever should be correct. But now look at this. The categories. The categories are all very similar. They are ease of use, I should actually have said correspondence with real world, and user control. The criteria are all full sentences which will be assessed on a Likert scale, from strongly disagree to strongly agree. The system gives immediate feedback. The user is aware of progress through the procedure. Graphics are realistic. It deals with familiar objects. The user control, it is clear how to navigate through the environment. The user can interact by typing or by drag and drop. Don't you think it's much nicer? I think you're tired. Do you like the first table better? The first table had so many grammatical styles. In this one, all the styles are the same. Some practical hints for this final big checking. Print the document. Yeah, in this green environment, please do print, even if you very seldom print. When you come to reading your dissertation or your proposal later on this year as a whole, print it. If it's a dissertation, staple each chapter separately. Don't ring bind it. Keep each chapter separate because you want to be able to refer between them. Spread them out on the nice soft carpet or on a big table. And don't put it all together because you want to be able to cross-reference. You want to work fast, not going like this and backwards and all over. So spread them all around you, then check that the format and style are consistent. Check that each one's got a chapter introduction, each one's got a chapter conclusion. Obviously you read it to pick up mistakes, you do a final proofread, but just make sure that the style of the chapters is fairly homogeneous. And then remember, before it's submitted for examination, there should be no minor errors. Oh, sure, the examiners are going to find content issues. They may not be errors. They may just ask you to elaborate or to, you know, something like that. But it can, the examiners' things can be sometimes something that's dealt with in 3 days, could well be something that's 3 months. You know, it all depends, and your supervisor will advise you. Ooh. But at this stage also, it will have been language edited. And of course that makes a huge difference. But you must also read it. Read the instructions very carefully, because the language editor may not exactly understand everything you said. That is what is scary about letting a language editor actually make changes to it. For example, I did a usability lab, an HCI lab study of people using a certain system. They were all videoed. Wow, what a lot of work. My office partner and I had to deal with 17 videos which ranged in length from 24 to 40 minutes. And we went over and over. So very, very intensive checking. But what I found was that we had to use the same sort of principles to all of them. And the thing was that the language editor had actually, when I looked at the section on that, wherever I said review the video, it was the researchers reviewed the videos with a hyphen. I mean, we viewed them again. The editor had changed every review with a hyphen, saying view again. She changed them all to review. But it wasn't reviewing at all. You know what reviewing is. You see, that reviewing was view again, re-view. So you do have to be very careful when you look at what the language editor has, what changes they've recommended. If it's track changes, don't just fly through with accept. If they've done it with color font, look at it all. If the best, I think, is sometimes if they actually write it as something that you should do. But I'm scared of track changes because it allows us, when we're tired, to just accept. So I rather like the old-fashioned way of a literature survey, an edit, when the editor actually gives you advice and you implement it. References, you'll hear a lot about that next week, I'm sure. Please check your references in 2 directions. Look in the book, make sure they're all in the back. When you find them in the back, you're working on paper, you tick them, and then at the end you go through it and see, are there any that are not ticked? That means that you used it and you took it out, or otherwise you've just missed it and you use a search to find it. So check them, make sure it's accurate. When you update the literature review, we've already said this, make sure that there are recent sources, really important. There is a complication here. That is that sometimes when you look at the literature, the new stuff, you find something which is very close to your work. Somebody else has been working at the same time. We had a situation recently where a student at UNISA had a title which was exactly the same as the title that somebody had in another university. We found it from the databases. So our student then changed her title. It happens. 2 people are working parallel at the same time. And neither found the other in the literature search because it's only happened now. So anyway, one of my students didn't find anybody who had done work with his name. But what he found was something that was absolutely fantastic. It was just, would have been a perfect foundation and guided him in his work. And so he said, what am I going to do? The examiners, maybe one of my examiners will even be this person. They're going to say, why didn't you consult that source? So what you do is you refer to it in your literature study, and you would just put a simple sentence like in, it might have strongly influenced the work if it had been available earlier. So say so. Say, if this source had been conducted at an earlier stage of the study, it would have influenced the work in that the researcher would have used this method or something like that. So you just say it. So you say, hey, I found it a bit late. If I'd found it earlier, I would have used it. Sorry, guys. Okay, I've already said, stay away from sweeping statements. don't sound like a politician opening a building. The famous comment, e-learning is going to change. E-learning will transform education in Africa. Avoid it. Use your wrap-up sections at the end of each chapter to just interpret the findings, and for the chapter conclusion. Similarly, in your conclusion chapter, have some reflection. Be rigorous and meticulous. That's the most important thing. You've really got to be hard on yourself in that check. Obviously, your supervisor will as well. But even supervisors, you know, they sometimes are loaded at a certain time of the year, and they have so much that they miss things. So really, it's a marvelous exercise for you. The gentleman who was talking to me in our last little break had to leave to go to a funeral, but he said he's learned so much that from Monday he's going to start implementing it in his writing, because his boss has actually spoken to him. He works in a corporate environment. His boss has spoken to him about his writing, and now he's realized what he's learned today is going to help him starting on Monday. And that is where this thing comes of being rigorous and meticulous, and the further you go, the better you will get at it. You really will. With all of you, your chapter 5 is going to be so much, the first draft will be so much better than your chapter 1. But be hard on yourself, be meticulous, check the details. I know it sounds boring, but go for it. Details are important. So to come to the end, did you address every research question or every objective? Remember what I said? The lesson learned for that student was, and for his supervisor. Neither of us had gone back to chapter 1 for 4 years, and in those 4 years his PhD had evolved. So it's very important. Make sure that you've objected, that you have investigated every objective, and also just look back at your research questions. Seeing what you've actually done, let's hope you will do it in the next 2-3 years. Maybe you just need to tweak them to fit with what you actually did. And in your conclusion, you summarize the answer to each. Oh, and this is so important. Don't forget the main research question. It is very easy to take your sub-questions 1 to 4, and address each one of them in conclusion and forget about the main one that was sitting on top of them in chapter 1. So you obviously go back to that as well. And then, of course, you have recommendations and avenues for future research. Very briefly, your supervisor may well tell you that every chapter is good. Yes, go ahead. And I will be finished, I promise you, in 5 minutes. And then you send them the complete document. You think they're going to send it back to you 3 days and say, yes, that's fine. Because you've checked, you've been through every chapter. Now I send you this, and you've given me enough work, it's going to take me at least another month. Well, there's the reason, in the middle. A chapter in the context of the whole is very different from a chapter on its own. Because, you see, the flow is not just inside the chapter, the flow is between. I already told you a while ago what to do. Put them all out. Make sure that the format and the so on is the same, but also make sure that each one prepares you for the next. Make sure that your argument does influence each one of them. Now, students can get very angry. I had one who did. But it's not a good idea. Now, in UNISA, I don't know about other places, we have a student supervisor agreement. So whenever I did a student supervisor agreement, I said that I required up to 8 weeks to read the final complete version. Well, that never got anywhere near that. It was never more than 2 or 3 weeks. But I put that there to cover myself and also to show the student that checking the thing as a whole is not Mickey Mouse. It's really difficult. So, then you reach the stage when all of this has been done and your process has produced a product. Now you polish the document by just checking on your internal consistency of terms, your styles, even your writing style, your text, your references, all those things. This is a wrap-up of what the presentation said. Always remembering that a chapter in the context of Big Book is different from a chapter on its own. And then that moment comes when it's all connected. Yay! And to end with the beginning, and I'm going to leave this to you to think about, the abstract. Because you're nowhere near to writing the abstract yet. And please, when you've got your topic, don't start with writing the abstract. What do you say, Prof. Tace?
It's a different, an article I'd like to start with.
Oh yes, because you know where the article's heading.
But definitely not with the
You don't even know what you're going to find. So what do? What your abstract should cover: what was the problem, why did you do it, how did you do it, what were your methods, what were the results, and what is the significance, what is the impact, the contribution, very important words for assessing things these days. What is the impact and the contribution of your work? Now there I've written them out again, but in more detail. But I'm not going to go through it now, it's not really relevant. But later on, have a look at this: the what, the why, the how, and the results. What were the results? What is the impact, the contribution, the significance of your work? Show that this study was indeed worthwhile. There is an abstract on the internet, written actually, I believe, by a medical researcher. There are many people in medicine and pharmaceutical who have written very, very good academic research. They are actually some of the lead researchers. And if you want to have a really good read-up of an abstract, there's the reference for what it's worth. But I am leaving it to you. So what needs panel beating? Well, every bit of it. I'm not sure if we've got sound here. If we do, this is rather fun. No, we don't have sound. The sound will make the noise of each one of these cars. If your thesis is a straightforward empirical study, and it's very difficult for anybody to argue with anything, it is robust and reliable, it's economical, and it's tough. Or if your thesis is like that car that president, what was the name of that president who died in a ditch under the road? Remember? He came to South Africa to a conference here, and he brought this massive car and all of his outriders, security guards, about another 10 or so cars with him, and they had jamming equipment. It was in Durban at the Durban Conference Centre. And as they drove through the city, if you were in one of those flats near the waterfront, all of a sudden, all of your electronic equipment died because they had jamming equipment. It was bulletproof, ultra luxury, and you may have a thesis which is very sophisticated. Perhaps a really complex philosophical ethnographic PhD. It may be like that. Or, oh, there's the sound. Yay! It may be quite short in comparison to your colleague's thesis, but it is good enough. It's sustainable, it's worth a degree, it's economical. Don't feel you have to be top of the class. Remember, at university, 50 is good. It's a simple thesis, but it's good enough. And if you get 55, great, you've got your degree. Nobody will ever ask what your mark was, but it's on your CV. And so it's like the lecturer's bug. It's fairly simple, and this particular one has a huge advantage, that if it packs up and it needs a kickstart, you just ask the students to wind you up, and you're on your way, and at 25 past we are done, and I am on my way. Thanks for being good listeners.
Thank you.